Good morning. Bright and early, 9 a.m. session, and you've come to listen about Windows 10 management technologies. My name's Mike Niehaus. I'm product manager on the Windows team, responsible for management and deployment. We're going to spend the next 75 minutes really talking about what's new in Windows 10 management and the Windows Store, introducing you to some new concepts, pointing you to some additional sessions for more details, because we've got a ton of sessions this week about Windows 10, so we've broken out most of the topics in here into sessions on their own. Just from a general positioning perspective, we've been at the management game in Windows forever. It's been, probably 20 years since the first management features were added into Windows. Back in the days where advanced management was a logon script. Things have come a long way since then. We have a lot of technologies built into Windows to manage the device, but we can never stand still because the needs continue to change. When we were first putting in those features 20 years ago, and even up to maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the need for management was really to address devices that were permanently attached to the corporate network, sitting under a desk or on a desk, and being used in an office all the time. Now things have changed. With these evolving business needs, we need to adjust the functionality in Windows so that you can still manage the device regardless of how it's being used. We know that there's still a need for the traditional management, but there's also the need for new ways of doing things as well to address the different ways that you use the devices. So that's what it comes down to, is providing choices. We want to be able to provide choices to make sure that you can use Windows 10 regardless of the scenario that you're trying to fit it into. We know that you've got existing infrastructure, that you have systems in place to manage Windows 10. We want to make sure that those will continue to work. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But then we also want to add more MDM capabilities, mobile device management, operating Windows from the cloud, to be able to move into this very mobile space that these devices are finding themselves in. When we talk about management choices, we have choices in a variety of different areas, starting with identity. Active Directory has been around for quite a while. How many of you are running Active Directory? Everyone in the room. Great. So now we have Azure Active Directory, which really won't replace Active Directory. It will complement Active Directory. We need to be able to have a cloud-based identity as well as an on-prem identity, and we can synchronize the two. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. For management technologies, we have Group Policy and System Center, Configuration Manager being used as the primary means to manage Windows 10 today. But we want to add into that robust MDM capabilities, which you could use with Windows Intune or with any other third-party MDM service. We started adding that in Windows 8.1. We'll continue to beef that up in Windows 10 to support the fully managed corporate device. For updates, WSUS has been around for quite a while. It will continue to be around. We'll also be adding new capabilities to Windows Update. You've seen the announcements around Windows Update for Business. As part of that evolution, we want to be able to patch machines directly from the cloud, but still give you the type of WSUS functionality that you have today. I want to be able to target groups of machines. I want to be able to set maintenance windows. I want to be able to really have control over when these updates are deployed, but maybe I don't want to run a WSUS server to do it. So we'll add more functionality to do that. We'll also add support for controlling updates using an MDM service. So even if you're doing Intune or AirWatch or Mobile Iron, you would be able to specify which updates you want to approve, and then the MDM service would pass that down to the client to tell it, install these updates. So really trying to provide the same type of functionality that you get via WSUS also from the cloud. There are multiple ownership models that we need to consider, not just the corporate-owned device. There's also the BYOD scenario, so we'll provide some management capabilities around that. We'll also support some new choose-your-own-device scenarios, which are just kind of a slight variation on the traditional enterprise device, where you want to provide your employees choices to let them go out and maybe buy any machine they want, but then turn it into an enterprise device. We'll talk more about that this afternoon in the deployment session, but that really requires the ability to take a device and easily enroll it into a management solution so that you can then manage it as a traditional corporate device without having to have them send it to an IT person, do some stuff to it, and then send it back to the end user. We can group these into a few different broad categories. Basic really has been around for a long time, and that's kind of what we had supported with BYOD, using Exchange ActiveSync as a mechanism for applying basic security policies to the device. That was a decent start. You're getting patches from Windows Update. You can get to your email, but you can't really do a whole lot beyond that. So what companies have been moving more toward is a lightweight management solution built around a mobile device management service. We want to make that a lot better in Windows 10. We want to add support for Azure Active Directory to support both the company-owned scenarios and the BYOD scenarios. Imagine being able to send instructions to your users saying that, well, you've got a Windows 10 device at home and you want to connect into corporate resources. Go into the Settings app, click to add a work account, put in your corporate credentials, done. You have enrolled your device into an MDM service. You've established the device trust for that device to allow that to be used as a conditional access verifier into your organization. And you can enable policies then to be pushed down to the device to configure VPN connections, to push out corporate applications, whatever needs to be done to make that user then be productive. We then still have the traditional full control where we use Active Directory, Group Policy, and System Center together to manage the devices, using WSUS either directly or as a layer underneath Config Manager to patch the machines. And that still remains and continues to pick up new functionality to support Windows 10 as well. When we look at all of the management features that are built into the OS, they kind of are existing in layers. We've got what's built into the client OS, things like WMI, PowerShell, the Group Policy Client, AppLocker. All of these management technologies continue to evolve and get incremental enhancements to them. We then have products that sit on top of that, like Windows Server with Active Directory, the Group Policy services tied into that, WSUS. Products then layered on top of that, like System Center Configuration Manager. None of this is a surprise. None of this is new. It's been around for quite a while. What we've now added as kind of the parallel structure to go along with that are these cloud services. Azure Active Directory, Azure RMS, Intune, the Windows Store, and those types of services to provide complements in this cloud-facing world. So let's talk a little bit more about existing infrastructure. How many of you are using Config Manager today? That is impressive. That's almost the whole room. So if you're going to deploy Windows 10, you need to run some supported version of Config Manager. Doesn't matter which one. Config Manager 2007 will be able to manage Windows 10, probably with a hotfix. Config Manager 2012 will manage and deploy Windows 10. It will require a service pack, which you saw announced this week. Config Manager 2012 R2, same story. It will manage and deploy Windows 10. It needs a hotfix, needs a service pack. That also was announced this week. Then there will also be, moving farther down the line, a new release of Config Manager, the technical preview of which was released this week, which will, of course, manage and support deploy Windows 10 as well, but also add some new features to really manage the Windows 10 functionality that's being added. So you'll be able to use your existing infrastructure. It will work just fine. You may need to move to the new version of Config Manager to get some more advanced features. But that doesn't mean you can't do it. Like, you would be able to use Config Manager Technical Preview, the vNext version, to do an in-place upgrade to Windows 10. They have built-in support for doing that. Well, with 2012 R2, it just means that you'd have to build a task sequence that has a few run command line steps to do the same thing. Maybe you need some support for pulling the business store apps into Config Manager so that you can deploy them. Config Manager Technical Preview, the vNext, will have that support built in. If you wanted to do that with Config Manager 2012 R2, you may need to build an app yourself and put in the command lines to achieve the same thing. So you'll be able to do it. It's just that the new version would add additional support for the new capabilities to simplify things a little bit. So what we would expect most customers to do is to upgrade to the latest 2012 Service Pack to fully support Windows 10. That enables them to get Windows 10 into the environment, and longer term, look at the Config Manager vNext release to simplify some of these other scenarios. From a server perspective, any supported server OS will work with Windows 10. There are no real schema requirements, no domain controller requirements. If you're running Active Directory today on a supported platform, it'll work fine with Windows 10. From an activation perspective, we will have a little bit of work to do to patch the KMS servers that you're using and to put new product keys on those KMS servers for Windows 10, but that's not really any different than what you've done with Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 8.1. Install the hotfix, apply a new key, now everything is happy. On the deployment side, another thing we'll talk more about this afternoon, MDT 2013 will be updated to support capturing a Windows 10 image and deploying a Windows 10 image. It's a very minor update, really to add support for the new deployment tools, the new ADK. So that's a simple upgrade to support Windows 10 as well. When we look at mobile device management, this is probably the biggest area of investment in Windows 10 from a management perspective. We had support in Windows 8.1 and in Windows Phone 8.1, really to support BYOD scenarios. So it had just enough to have a personal device be managed. On the phone side, we took it a little bit further, where we could lock down the device, configure it as a kiosk or a single-purpose line of business device. With Windows 10, first, we're consolidating the functionality between the two OSs, so they'll have exactly the same MDM agent in both. And we're significantly beefing up the support that's in the MDM stack to add a lot more settings. The types of things that we're looking at really cover the whole life cycle of Windows 10, of the mobile device management process, adding things from enrollment all the way through security, configuration, wiping the device, all of that. On the provisioning side, we'll greatly simplify the enrollment process. We'll make it easy to even do something like the Intune team's been talking about, of being able to go in the Intune console, export a provisioning package that contains all the details for enrolling, where you can then just send that to the user and say, here, double-click this. They double-click the file, it enrolls the device in management, off they go. We'll have other bulk enrollment processes as well. We'll even tie in the enrollment process to an Azure Active Directory join. So imagine taking a device and joining it into Azure AD, just like you would join it into Active Directory today. Once it's joined into Azure AD, it will automatically enroll in an MDM service. So one operation takes care of two things. Gets you to the point where you can sign into the device using Azure Active Directory, and also sets it up for management to push down the policies to the device. You can do all the expected things too, configure VPN, Wi-Fi, push out applications. We'll add more integration with the business store, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. We'll add support for a full device wipe, which is not something that you could do with Windows 8.1. You could do a data wipe, remote business data removal, to get rid of the company data, but now we'll add support for a remote triggered full device wipe as well, basically to do a reset of the device back to the factory initial image. There is a session on Thursday afternoon that Janani's presenting where she'll go in depth on the details of all of those different MDM features. If you went to Jim Alcove's Windows 10 in the Enterprise session yesterday, Janani did the demo there. She'll dive much deeper into this for that. There's a question. Yeah, so that's a good question. The previous slide, were those features specifically for Windows 10 on the desktop, or were they also for Windows 10 mobile, or were they for both? Yeah, either way. We would have feature parity for the most part between both. So the things that we can do on a Windows phone, we would also be able to do on Windows desktop. So that remote wipe, yeah, we could already do that on Windows phone devices. Now we're adding that to the desktop devices as well. So much more information covered in this session on Thursday, where we'll go through a lot of the details. We'll take a little bit a deeper look at this in a minute too. On the identity side, everyone's running Active Directory. We've already proved that. Azure Active Directory is its counterpart in the cloud. We expect most organizations to use these two together. So you set up synchronization between the two and leverage both at the same time. Windows 8.1 and earlier versions really had no understanding of Azure Active Directory at all. Didn't even know it existed. Windows 10 will be fully Azure AD aware. Not only can you join a device into Azure AD and then sign into that device with a cloud account directly, that's useful in some scenarios, but more importantly, it understands the relationship between an AD account and an AAD account. So imagine your existing machines. You're going to have them joined into AD. The user is going to sign in with their Active Directory account. They're going to access, say, Office 365 in the cloud. You've probably seen that today where you change your password in Active Directory, you launch Outlook, it goes to talk to Office 365, it says, oh, your password's not correct, please type it in again. That's because Windows doesn't understand the link between AD and AAD, so it has to prompt for the Azure Active Directory credentials, even though it already has them because it has the AD credentials. With Windows 10, that'll be seamless. That'll be a single sign-on experience. So when you access Azure AD-based services like Office 365, the Business Store, Intune, any other Azure-based service that's using Azure AD for authentication, it can transparently log you on to that service without you having to type in those details. So we end up with a few different scenarios around Azure AD. We have the org-owned machines, which we can join into Azure Active Directory directly. We can log in with those accounts. We can then access cloud-based resources and even get single sign-on support into on-prem resources as well. So imagine a cloud-based machine that comes into a corporate network. It can still get to corporate resources too. An Active Directory machine joins AD, but then can be trusted by cloud-based services too. So the directory synchronization between those two enables that to work either direction. On the personal side, you can take a BYOD device, add a work account to it, which would be an Azure AD account, to establish that level of trust and the single sign-on support there too.
Would Azure AD, would that middle scenario there replace the need for direct access?
So would Azure AD replace the need for direct access? Probably not directly. The direct access enables a device that's not on the corporate network to get to corporate resources. If you took direct access away, Azure AD by itself wouldn't solve that problem. Well, unless the device physically connected to the corporate network, and then you don't have a problem. You could make those types of scenarios work using some Azure AD, or not Azure AD, some Azure proxy capabilities where you can actually route the traffic through Azure back to your corporate network. But that's really more like a VPN scenario, except that the VPN goes through Azure to get there. So there are ways to do it, but yeah, I wouldn't say that this replaces direct access. It's potentially another twist. Direct access is an interesting case because direct access is configured via group policy. So an Azure AD joined device doesn't receive group policy, it receives MDM, and you can't get the direct access settings to a device via MDM. It's impossible to do. But that's a much longer discussion around how do you access corporate networks from outside. There is a session this week that the networking team is running that talks about the VPN capabilities being added into Windows 10. Those are much more focused on those mobile device management scenarios, giving you direct access style features without using direct access. So I want always-on connectivity. I want app-triggered VPN connections. I want app-specific VPN connections that no other application on the machine can use. So there are more advanced capabilities tied to that.
Quick question on the Azure AD join and trust. So that typically on-prem requires Kerberos. What is it doing in Azure AD to establish that trust? What does it require on the back end?
It's magic. My suggestion for that one is go to one of the Azure AD sessions. It's issuing tickets, so it's based on a similar setup, but as far as the actual implementation details, that gets to the point where I say, I don't care as long as it works. But if you care, there are Azure AD sessions that will explain that. So the basic setup that you have is you set up your on-premise AD to synchronize to Azure AD. There's a simple application that you download and install on a single device to do that. It's a simple wizard-driven process. You type in your Azure AD account and password. You type in an Active Directory account and password, and it can then set up the periodic replication between those two. Once you've done that, the cloud then knows about all your on-prem accounts. The local directory is aware of the link between this as well. Everything works out in the end. Now, in order to get the single sign-on support working with some of these web-based services, there are going to need to be some little tweaks to the applications to get them to recognize this, but like the Office team is already working on that. The Intune team is already working on that to put it into their company portal, so there'll be some tweaks to make that work. We've already done it for a few of our key sites that we use, like in the development process. We use Visual Studio Online. So we've already set up Visual Studio Online to do single sign-on into Visual Studio so that we can do our bug tracking. So let's look at Azure AD in a little bit more detail and tie in MDM at the same time. Oops. Helps when you push the right button. So I've got a Windows 10 client, and it's booted up for the first time, and it's now in the first run experience, the UBI process, where I can actually enroll a device into Azure AD from here. I accept the default settings. In this case, it's a Windows 10 Enterprise installation. So it just assumes that since this is Windows 10 Enterprise, it's a company-owned device. I don't need to ask. It will just ask you for your company credentials. It doesn't actually say, please type in your Azure Active Directory credentials. It says, please enter your work or school account. That's Azure AD speak for Azure AD account. Because if they just said Azure AD account, most people would look at it and say, I have no idea what you're talking about. But work or school account, oh, they know what that is. They can type that in. This is the same challenge that Janani had yesterday, if you saw her demo, that it takes too long to get through this with all of these people on the network. even when I'm on a dedicated Wi-Fi network. The pipe out of here is not fast enough. But we'll give it a second to see if it comes back with actual login prompt. I've actually gone through the process from my hotel room, where at 1 in the morning the network performance is pretty good, and snapshotted it at various points along the way, so I can move forward to show you the end result. But the idea is that it will prompt you for your ID and password. You type that in, it validates it, enrolls the device in MDM, and off you go. That's supposed to be the easy part. The session on networking, I would have to look at the schedule. I don't remember when that one was scheduled, but yeah, it should be obvious. Search for Windows 10 VPN and you will find it. I think it's the only Windows 10 VPN focused session. So now hopefully I can click continue and it will actually ask. One thing I wanted to point out here is there are some messages here. If you plan to join your PC to your work domain, select Continue and choose the link to set up Windows with a local account instead. What that's saying is this process doesn't join the machine into Active Directory, it joins the machine into Azure Active Directory. You'd be surprised at how many people, even inside of Microsoft, have done this and accidentally joined their device to Azure Active Directory. If you've got Office 365, AAD is already out there. Oh, it wants my work account. Okay, I type in my ID and password. Presto, I'm now joined into Azure AD. Well, that's great until you go in and try to join the device into AD and find that that particular setting is disabled. Well, why is it disabled? Well, you can't be joined to AD and AAD at the same time. Fortunately, now with the current builds, you can actually disjoin an Azure AD enrollment, which initially you couldn't do. So we had people that got stuck in Azure AD and couldn't get out. Fortunately, we fixed that now. But yeah, read the message. That's basically what it's telling you. If you want to do an AD account, you need to go ahead and create a local account on the machine. And once you've signed in, then you can do the join. Most enterprises never see this screen. This screen is going to be automated by the deployment process, using MDT, using Config Manager. So they never see the UBI process run through, but if you ever do it, you'll see these messages. So let me go ahead and continue. I see lots of spinning wheels. Let's hope it asks for my account fairly quickly.
For PCs that are joined with Azure AD, is there anything changing with KMS so that devices that are not connected to the corporate network on a regular basis stay activated?
Yeah, that's a good question. The question was, if you join a device into Azure AD and you're using KMS for activation, can it activate? Well, if it's on the internet, no, it can't. It won't be able to talk to the KMS server. If it's internal, it can find the DNS entry for the KMS server and talk to it directly, but if it's out on the internet, no, you would need to use a MAC key to activate that to ensure that it can continue to stay activated if it's not going to touch the corporate network frequently. That's something that we've talked about, that maybe we need to add support for cloud-based activation. Like today we have AD-based activation where you can put your KMS key into an Active Directory blob. We're thinking about doing the same thing with Azure AD, so you could store that blob in Azure AD and pull it down as part of the join process. But it's not there today. So let me go ahead and sign in. Again, it's trying to clarify, if you have Office 365, that's probably the account that you want to type in, reminding people that it is your work account. I always love this screen because it looks like you didn't click the button, but you really did. It goes anyway. So now it'll join, and then it'll begin the initial login process. This is the slow part of it, which is why I wouldn't sit around here and watch this one go by, because after it signs in, it begins to install the apps. So you see the pulsing colors for the first login experience. That's way too slow. I mean, that takes several minutes. We are working on that. We're trying to optimize that so that process will be much faster, that you'll get to the desktop much faster, and then the modern applications will continue to install in the background. But that's still a work in progress, not in the current builds.
Can you select which Intune policies that should apply to a new device, or do you have to find that out?
So the question was, can you choose what Intune policies target the new device? One of the changes in MDM in Windows 10 is that policies can target the machine or target the user. And the management service, Intune in this case, has a choice of what settings get pushed to the device based on the identity of the device and the identity of the user. So it's really up to Intune to decide what policies to push down. Because you're enrolling a device with a user, it knows about both right away and could push down both sets of policies, but it would be up to you to define what policies get pushed immediately to the device. So there's the pulsing colors. That'll continue on for several minutes. We don't want to wait several minutes. Let's fast forward this machine a little bit.
Did you do a special type of sysprep to get it to join Azure AD?
No, actually, the question was, did I do a special type of sysprep to get it to join Azure AD? No, I just applied an image without an unattend.xml. So it's going through the standard UBI experience.
Oh, that's default Windows 10 experience now?
Yes, with Enterprise. If you did the same thing with Windows 10 Pro, it would ask one more question. It would ask, is this a work device or is this a personal device? If you say it's a personal device, it asks for a Microsoft account. If you say it's a work device, work or school, it then asks for an organization account, which is an Azure AD account.
Ask for the Microsoft account if you use Windows Enterprise.
If you use Windows Enterprise, yeah, it skips that screen, assumes the answer is work device, and continues on from there. So it won't ask for MSAs. Okay, so this is fast forwarded to the machine is fully set up. If I bring up a command prompt, because you can't have a 300 level session without a command prompt, we need to make this so that you can actually see it. If I look at who am I, it says I am Azure AD John Smith, so it knows that I'm signed in with an Azure AD account. And if I look at the environment variables on the machine, I can actually see the logon server here is Azure AD. So it knows I was authenticated with Azure AD. It knows what account I'm using that came from Azure AD. Everything points to Azure AD at this point. We can also see that if we go into the Settings app. That's one of the challenges with the current Windows 10 build. There are some times that the Start menu just doesn't work. Let's do the other trick. Let's try that again. We are pushing a hotfix out to Windows 10 to try to address some of these challenges. There we go. So let's bring up settings. And they're trying slowly to evolve most of the settings out of the control panel and into the settings app. So you've been seeing that as the builds go by. If you want to see where the domain join information is, you need to go under System. And I had a quiz with a different group a few weeks ago where I asked them, well, where would you think to go next? And no one got it right, but now you've had time to play with it. So yes, it's under About. So you can see About, and it doesn't show you what you are joined to. It just says that, well, you can leave it if you want. So, okay. We have a little bit of work to do. That's all right. But if we weren't joined, it would give you a choice to join your Active Directory or join a cloud. One does an AD join, one does the Azure AD join, so you would do them from here. The other thing that we wanted to look at, though, was at the same time that we did the join, It's set up, helps when I click in the right place. It's set up an MDM enrollment. Hello. There are no bugs in this. Really? How hard is it to launch settings? Yeah, I could log out and log back in again. I'm hoping I can just kill it and launch it again. Even though I couldn't see it, it was still running. So if I go under Accounts, Work or School, that's interesting. It didn't save the connection details. When I killed it, I think it lost track of that. But it is joined to an MDM service. It's just not going to show that to me at the moment. But the way we can tell it's enrolled, that disappeared as well when I killed Explorer. There was a pinned icon. Yeah, you got to love it. But we are enrolled. It pushed down policies. It pushed down an application. The company portal's installed on the machine. It's just, yeah, it's improving. We're getting there. So that's the client side. We'll skip over that for now. We also wanted to look at the server side, which is over here somewhere. If you haven't set up Azure AD before, you basically need an Azure subscription or an Office 365 or an Intune subscription, which take care of this for you. And just create a directory on Azure. You can create as many of these as you want. As you can see, I've got quite a few, and quite a few of them are Contoso domains, so my demo and testing domains. Like I can create Contoso West here as a directory. I can synchronize it with Active Directory and see my local AD accounts as well as any cloud specific accounts. In this case, I created one account in the cloud for administering the Azure AD domain, and then I've got 3 accounts that were synchronized with my on-prem Active Directory as well as my Microsoft account, which is what my Azure subscription is set up with, so it has full rights as well. So all of that is set up. The settings on Azure AD allow you to specify how you want to configure this. Do you want to set up replication? Do you want to enable device enrollment or Active Directory or Azure AD join? So you do get settings related to that in the profile to configure that. But for the most part, once it's set up, you don't need to go into Azure to touch much because the directory synchronization running in the background takes care of this. You have a couple of options on how you set up the directory synchronization, because the Azure AD account really needs to have the same password as the AD account in order to be useful. You can set up that the easy way, which is by synchronizing the password hashes from your Active Directory into Azure AD, so that Azure AD can verify those. Or you can set up ADFS. ADFS uses 1 or 2 servers on your internal network that are exposed to the internet. Authentication requests get passed to those servers. They validate the password against your Active Directory and then return back to Azure AD to say yes or no, that password was valid. So if you're paranoid and don't want password hashes in the cloud, set up ADFS. If you don't care, password hash synchronization is very easy. I don't think Azure AD is going to come up here. Slow networks. But in any case, you can set that up. If you've got an MSDN subscription, MSDN subscriptions come with an Azure AD account. Very easy to go in then and set up a directory. They're actually free, so you don't even need to put in a credit card. Like in this case, I have an MSDN subscription. I've put in my MSDN details, which gives me like $120 credit a month. I use like 2 cents a month because I've got some storage in Azure that it charges me for each month. But all this Azure AD stuff is free. There are some paid levels to Azure AD that add more functionality, but the basic Azure AD support is free.
How does the user settings roll with Azure AD compared to ordinary Microsoft accounts? Kind of manage it?
That's a good question. 2 questions there. One was one that you didn't ask that I had to answer first before I answered the real question. The question he asked was, well, the settings that roam with the Azure AD account, can you control those? Yes, but with the Windows 10 RTM, we won't support Azure AD for settings roaming. That'll come later. It won't be done at RTM. It'll take a few more months to get that added into there. But the goal is to support the same type of settings roaming that you get with a Microsoft account, with an Azure AD account, roaming those settings into Azure storage where that you can control what region those settings are stored in, and when the person is removed from Azure AD or their account is decommissioned, it can blow away that data as well. So giving the IT administrator control over that. But that will take a few more months to get that working.
When you join now, you join the Azure AD and Intune, did you say that?
You can do both at the same time. Basically, you would configure in Azure AD the URL of the service that you want to enroll in. So if you're using Intune, you'd put in the enterpriseenrollment.manage.microsoft.com. If you were using AirWatch or Mobile Iron, you'd put in a different URL. But then as part of the Azure AD join process, that gets passed down to the client. The client says, oh, okay, I need to enroll in MDM. It uses the same credentials and that URL to pass that along to the service.
So where do you do that?
You don't today. So the question was, where do you do that? And you don't see that in the Azure AD configuration. That's going to show up hopefully closer to RTM. It's a hidden attribute in Azure AD at this point. Still coming.
How are you handling isolation of company to company in Azure? They have their own. Like, I mean, if people are replicating half of their AD to the cloud, I can see security people getting a little nervous.
Yeah, and that's a fair discussion, which is why we have so many Azure-related sessions here. There is one on Friday that gets deeper into Azure Active Directory and Windows 10 specifically, and there was one yesterday that I think is being repeated today on identity and the cloud or something like that, which is an Azure AD-based session that Nasos is delivering, that kind of talks about those types of issues, that how is it stored, how does it work, it's a multi-tenant directory, how are they separated, can we control what region my accounts are stored in? I don't want my accounts in the U.S. because we don't trust the U.S. government. I don't want the accounts in Europe because, well, who knows, but everyone has a different reason for wanting some control over that, so they've been building those types of controls to meet the company's requirements. So definitely check out those sessions to get a much more in-depth view of Azure AD. When we look at managing using an MDM service like Windows Intune, the big goal for the System Center team, which includes Intune, is being able to simplify the administration and support all the populations of devices that you have out there. This is something that we've heard from Gartner analysts and other people in the industry saying that, well, mobile device management solutions sprung up from nowhere to solve a need, to solve a problem. There were these iPads and Android devices and things out there that needed to be managed. So these MDM services came into existence to support that. The traditional PC management solutions, like Configuration Manager and all the other desktop management products out there, were just too slow to adjust to this new device world. But they expect all of that to come back together. Gartner thinks that over the next couple of years, most products will merge together so that you can end up with one solution that manages all the different types of devices. That's been the Config Manager and Intune goal for the last 2 to 3 years. They've been working toward that to create this single pane of glass where you have 2 different backends. You have Config Manager on-prem that manages all of your corporate-owned, corporate network-connected devices. And then you can use Intune and the MDM service to manage all the mobile devices. Not just Windows mobile devices, but also iPads and all the other types of things that have crept into your environment as well. But if you really want to make sure that that doesn't double the amount of administration that you have to do. So the goal with Config Manager is to give you one console where you do something once, and at that point, it can be maybe an application that you set up. You can deploy it to both. So making that an easy administrative experience, but still supporting both methods or both scenarios of managing the device. In this case, I have a Config Manager environment, which I can pull up here, which I've integrated with Intune. So if I look under administration on this device, I have cloud services, and I have tied an Intune subscription into my Config Manager environment, which enables me to do something like create an application where I can point to maybe a line of business app that I've created inside of my organization. And of course, it wants a UNC path. That should make it happy. So I can set up the app, which is easy enough. I point to the AppX file. It gets all the details that it needs out of that. So that adds it into Config Manager. Then I just need to deploy it. The Windows apps deploy per user, so when I say that I want to deploy this, I will specify a group of users that I want to deploy it to. So I can say all users. And then I can choose what distribution points I want to use. Now, I see 2 of them. In my case, I have one Config Manager server. That's the first item on the list. That is Config Manager itself. The second one, manage.microsoft.com, is Intune. So Intune just shows up as another distribution point. All I have to do to make this available to the Intune and Config Manager clients is check both boxes. When I click OK and go through the summary, the rest of the wizard, it will then distribute the bits to both places. It'll upload it into Azure Storage to make it available to Intune. It will distribute it to all the Config Manager distribution points. And the company portal on either side will show this device as available to the user. I could even say this is a mandatory app and push it out via Config Manager and Intune. So lots of flexibility there with Config Manager to do this. The same types of capabilities apply to policies and inventory and all the other Config Manager capabilities. As soon as you link the 2 together, you get information from the cloud and from the on-prem devices. You can manage both sets together. So if you haven't tried that, try it out. It's easy enough to sign up for an Intune demo account, which is all I did here. So install the preview of Config Manager, get a demo tenant for Intune, connect the 2 together, and play with it for a while. Works pretty well. Intune is dependent on Azure AD, so you do need to have Azure AD set up first, but that's not too bad to set up either. It's a good intellectual exercise. How does the device get the SCCM client? Well, so the question was, how does the device get the SCCM client? And the answer is it doesn't. If it's a directly Config Manager managed client with connected to the corporate network, your traditional Config Manager client, you're going to push that client out to the device using a startup script or using Windows Update or using client push, or they've got like 5 different ways to push the client out to the device. But if you're using an MDM managed device, the agent is built into the OS. It's the MDM support in the operating system that talks to the Intune service. So there's no software that needs to be installed. Once the device is enrolled into the Intune service, it does push down the company portal app so that you can then see the apps that are available to you, but the agent itself is already built into the OS. Same if you were using AirWatch or Mobile Iron. They don't have a client at all. Intune doesn't have a client that's used in this scenario. You just use what's built into Windows. We can't ignore the existing group policy support that we have in place. We will be adding new policies for Windows 10 to support the start screen, to support the Microsoft Edge browser, to configure the Microsoft Hello next generation credentials, to set up application management controls, basically to set the sideloading policy. So we will be adding new GPOs. Most of those aren't yet present in the current build, so you can't see them, but they will be coming in later builds. There's a question over here.
The question, the current SCCM client can take advantage of branch cache-related functionality from its distribution. Are there plans now with the Windows Update for Business that was talked about to embed some of the peer-to-peer functionality for the Intune EP capability?
Yeah, so the question was really tied to Windows Update for Business and Intune/MDM, if we would be able to do peer-to-peer distribution with the Intune content. Initially, probably not. The initial peer-to-peer will only work with Windows Update content. Windows Update content would include OS updates, Office updates, and application updates after the apps have been initially installed from the Windows Store. But for other types of content pushed via MDM, no, that's going to use HTTP for the most part and pull it directly from the cloud. Something that we're looking at, but not initially. So new policies in Windows 10. There are some new things that if you skipped Windows 8 and Windows 8.1, you've missed out on, so you'll get some new benefits from that as well. We've added support in Windows 8 to cache policies so that if there's a slow connection to the domain controller, we don't even wait. We just use the cached version of the policies. We apply from the local copy, and we update using the domain controller policies later asynchronously. So we don't wait around. We can also have better support for IPv6 networks. We have better support for direct access clients. Before, we would assume that they were on a fast network when they might not be. So making sure that it's aware of direct access and the fact that just because you're on the internet and have a 100 meg connection up to the local cable provider doesn't mean you have a fast connection back into your corporate network. So it's aware of that and is better handling that scenario. We added support for larger policies. We improved the overall performance. We've even added support for doing remote GP updates so that you could initiate a group policy update remotely just to do some troubleshooting that way. So all of those are built into Windows 10 as well. You can try those out. The Microsoft Desktop Optimization Pack is another set of tools that layers on top of Windows Enterprise. All of these will support Windows 10 as well. There will be minor updates required, maybe, to some of the tools to support Windows 10. Right now, AppV and UEV, we think are going to be in pretty good shape. There probably aren't any updates needed for those. MBAM, we think is going to be okay. Dart, there'll be a new version of Dart, just because every version of Windows gets released with a new version of Windows PE. Dart's very specific to Windows PE. It adds recovery tools to it. So every time there's a new PE, there's a new Dart. So you will see a new version of that. And Advanced Group Policy Management is actually going to pick up some new capabilities with the update that comes out shortly after Windows 10 RTM that will add PowerShell support to do a lot of the Dart functionality. So you can automate a lot of the things that you would have done with the UI before. So we expect all of these to just work with Windows 10. Maybe there'll be some hot fixes, but at this point we don't think that will happen. There will also be some new maintenance releases coming out, probably a month or so after RTM, that are basically the roll-up of all of the fixes that we put in. Just simple maintenance service packs that you can deploy, but they're not required for Windows 10. But you will see those come out after RTM. So let's talk about the business store. How many of you tried Windows 8 and Windows 8.1 and tried to use the Windows Store and then discovered that, well, you had to use a Microsoft account, and if you want to buy something, you had to use a credit card, and it belongs to the end user, it doesn't belong to the company. I'm sure you can probably come up with other things that you didn't like about it too. So we knew that we needed to take what we did in Windows 8.1 and get it ready for business. So there are a variety of things that we needed to do to support that, to enable us to leverage the Windows Store in businesses. Now, it was possible for you to bypass the Windows Store altogether and build your own company portal using an MDM solution or using Config Manager, sideloading the applications onto a device, which was great for line of business apps where you had the install files, but for store apps, you couldn't get the install files. Most common requests we would get, I want to put Link into my image. There's this modern version out in the Windows Store. Can you give me the install files? Well, no, we can't. So as a result, it became very difficult to use the Windows Store apps unless you allowed Microsoft accounts to be used to acquire these user by user from the store. So we want to fix all of that. At the same time, there are other things that we'd like to fix, like we don't really need multiple stores. Let's merge all of them together so that we're using the same store for Windows, for phones, for Xboxes, everything else, built around the same infrastructure, built around the same application platform, really pulling all of these together. That's already happening. Then we can add in a new piece, the business store. This is a website, basically. You, as an IT administrator, would log into this website to acquire apps for your organization. They can be free apps. Eventually, they can be paid apps as well, so we'll get there. And once we get to that point, you would be able to use payment instruments that make sense for you, which might not be credit cards. It might be purchase orders or invoices or things like that. So adding in the capabilities that organizations expect. You can then manage the licenses for those. You can assign them directly to people. You can make them available to users so that they can do self-service. You can push them through your MDM service. You can pull them into Config Manager. So lots of different scenarios that we want to support. It's basically a layer that's specifically for businesses built on top of the Windows Store. From an end user perspective, they're never going to use the business store directly. They're always going to be using either the Windows Store that's built into Windows 10 or a company portal application provided by Config Manager, Intune, or some other third-party MDM solution. So we had to add in additional capabilities, still at this point tied to Windows apps, modern apps, whatever you want to call them. It is going to leverage Azure Active Directory to access the business store, and in some scenarios for the end user as well to access to be able to acquire the applications. There are some other scenarios that don't require Azure Active Directory. We'll go through those in a minute. If you want to, you can still do the company portal. You can still use Config Manager. You can still use Intune, still use AirWatch, still use Mobile Iron. So all that's fine. But we'll provide flexibility so that you can support this. So we've got a variety of scenarios. We need to be flexible. We need to support any size organization, so we don't want to make this any more complicated than it has to be. And we need to converge overall. So let's talk about one other thing on this slide before we move on. Reconciled sideloading processes. How many of you have ever complained about sideloading for Windows 8.1? A few of you, which probably reflects the number of you that actually put in a serious amount of consideration of Windows 8.1. But the sideloading processes were a little bit of a headache. In Windows 8, you needed to have a machine running Enterprise joined to a domain. With 8.1, we extended that to Pro, so Pro or Enterprise joined into a domain. Then you needed to set a policy, and then there were some certificate requirements for the apps. With Windows 10, we'll do away with the whole side-loading key and must be joined to a domain and all that kind of stuff, and just provide a simple checkbox to enable side-loading, which can be set via policy as well. So that's the first part. And then on the certificate side, we want to make sure that we can use either the phone-style Symantec cert or the traditional Windows style of using, well, any trusted cert that you care to use. So there is a session that John Vincel's doing this week that gets into much more detail around that. So if you're really curious about side-loading and some of these more involved application deployment scenarios, check out his session. So scenarios then. There's two basic groupings. Online scenarios, offline scenarios. Online ones, use Azure AD. Offline ones, don't. Now you as the IT administrator signing into the business store, you will always have to use Azure AD to sign into the business store. It uses Azure AD for authenticating you as an administrator. But the end user, they don't necessarily need one. They do for the online scenarios, but if you're going to go offline, then you can use any account. Doesn't really matter. In the online scenarios, the store takes care of tracking the licenses. The store takes care of everything. In the offline scenarios, you do. So you get the bits, you deploy the bits, you take care of counting the licenses. All of that stuff is back on you. So it basically treats these Windows Store apps the same way that you do desktop apps today. Here are the install files. Here's how you install them. Keep track of how many copies you've installed and make sure that doesn't exceed the number of licenses that you've acquired. We will at least handle the updating of the apps. So once the app has been pushed out to a device, the Windows Update agent will see that it's there, and if a new version is published, it will push that new version down to the device automatically. So online, we have the ability to do a private store within the Windows Store, where basically you launch the Windows Store client. When you're logged in with your AD or AAD account, you see a Contoso Apps section in there. You can select the app you want and install it. You can have deep link type pushes through MDM or Config Manager, or you can directly assign a license to the end user. All of those scenarios work just fine. All of those are Azure AD dependent. On the offline side, you can download the bits and inject them into your images, sysprep and capture. When that image is deployed, the app automatically installs per user. You can pull down the bits and deploy it with MDM or Config Manager or any other software distribution tool, just like any other app today. You just build the PowerShell or DISM command to do that. Like we said before, the vNext Config Manager will know how to do that natively, so you don't need to build the command line. It'll do it for you. Or you can just manually install it yourself using a PowerShell command yourself. So let's look at this a little bit just by jumping into the business store and see the basics of how this would work.
When you said private store, can you force them to have the private store and only the private store?
Yeah, so the question was, if you have the private store within the Windows Store, can you force it to show just the private store and nothing else? You can. You can configure a policy that turns off all the other store categories, so then the only thing that shows up are your curated list of company applications. If you don't do that, what the user ends up seeing is the public store and the private store. If they select something from the public store, then they have to have a Microsoft account to install that. If they select something from the private store, then they're installing it using their Azure AD account. So it's the difference between public and private. So I can go to the business store. I can sign in with my Azure AD account, which will, of course, cause me challenges this morning. Let's go back to the website and try that again. Doesn't like sitting on that screen. Now I'm logged in. I can see all the applications that are available, and I can just browse like a traditional shopping experience, find the apps that I want, and acquire them for my organization. So maybe I want the modern version of PowerPoint to be used offline. I can say that I want to get the app. It says, well, you'll use your management tool to distribute the offline licensed apps, as we've already associated that. That sounds fine, so I'll confirm that. And then it's added into my organization's inventory of applications that are available to me. So I can see that PowerPoint's been acquired, and I can then just use it with Config Manager or the management tool. Now, if you actually want to see that, maybe you were in Jim's session yesterday and you saw that already, but Ford and Tejas are going to do a session later this week where they'll go into much more detail around this to show you these scenarios and a few others as well, so you can check those out. But you can see a few other things here at the same time. We have a Dynamics application that's been acquired as an online application, so it's going to be tracked using Azure AD accounts. We could click to add it to the private store, which is what causes it to show up on the Windows client. We can see here that we've got an application, a line of business application that we've uploaded into the Dev Center and then made available to just users of this organization, so we can support line of business apps too, where in this case it's already been assigned to 3 users, so we could even see who those users are just clicking in and seeing the list of people who've acquired that particular application. So that's the business store in a very short demo. If you want to see the much longer version, you can check out these guys' session later in the week. I click someplace I wasn't supposed to, and what happens? It doesn't show the right thing. But you get the idea that there are still some things to be done before this is available for public preview. Still a work in progress. But that's the idea, that we'll be adding this type of functionality to let you manage the applications and licenses through here. So the question was, will there be an SDK for non-SCCM tools? And there are a couple of parts to that. One is for integration with the business store itself. So there are APIs to allow a management tool to integrate with the business store. Those will be public, and I think the guys are already working with quite a few vendors to enable that integration. From a IT pro perspective, the process of installing and managing the applications, you can certainly do that yourself. There are APIs, DISM command line capabilities, PowerShell commandlets, so all that can be done as well. John would cover more of that in his session later in the week as well. So all of that can be doable, all of that will be documented. So the question was, when will the Windows Store be available for Windows 8.1, or will it be available for Windows 8.1? No, everything that we're talking about is Windows 10 and on. So no new features will be added to Windows 8.1 at this point. It's pretty much just riding to the end of its days. Yeah, we hear that a few times. The question was, can I, instead of assigning the application to a user, can I assign it to a group? At this point, no, but it's something that we're looking at, and certainly high on the list of things to support as we move forward, but probably not initially.
Will you be able to publish
Win32 apps, I think were mentioned briefly at Build last week, that the intention, sure, is to add support for deploying Win32 apps through the Windows Store. Once that support's added, then, of course, the business store picks up those capabilities as well. So it's a slightly longer time frame, but, yeah, we'll get there. So the session that I was referring to from Ford and Tejas is Thursday afternoon. They'll go through all of the scenarios, well, as many scenarios as they can, and talk more about the capabilities and the timelines and features that are tied into this. So that's basically what we're investing in for the store, where we want to provide the business store to allow orgs to acquire apps for their organization, to manage licenses, to provide the private store to make a kind of a self-service, simple storefront for maybe for smaller organizations that don't have any complex requirements around targeting groups or getting approvals or doing anything like that. So that'll be available. We'll also have support for MDM and desktop management solutions like System Center to provide full management support as well. So just to summarize, you've heard so much about Azure Active Directory throughout this session. It would be good for you to get familiar with Azure Active Directory if you haven't already done that, because there are just so many different ways it can be used in combination with Windows 10. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, look into setting up directory synchronization. Not only does it enable some of these Windows 10 scenarios, but it also enables Office 365, Intune, and all these other products. So try that out. It is best if you're using the current versions of System Center Configuration Manager and Windows Server. You can make it work with the older versions. They're fully supported, but you'll get the best functionality from the latest releases. So try to move forward. The deployment for the new versions of Config Manager will be fairly straightforward. So if you're running Config Manager 2012, 2012 R2, moving to vNext is almost like a service pack. It's the typical next, finish, install on the server side, followed by a push out of the new client, just like you would with a typical service pack. So get ready for that. Deploy the new service packs initially. Look at the vNext as you move forward. Look at the mobile device scenarios. Maybe you want to consider managing some groups of devices using MDM and Azure AD. Maybe the traveling machines that never come into the corporate office, that you just need lightweight management on those. And then use System Center Active Directory Group Policy for everything else. So you can do some mixing and matching. Look at the scenario-based management. And get ready to work with these Windows apps, because we're putting a lot of emphasis on providing a universal Windows platform for developers to build one app that runs on the desktop, runs on the phone, runs on an Xbox, runs on a Surface Hub, runs on every device that we make. So very good story from a developer perspective to start building these applications. Then you as an IT pro need to know how to deploy and manage them. With that, let's wrap it up. If you've got any other questions, come up front and see me, as we're just about out of time. I think it says I've got 1 minute and 15 seconds left, but please fill out your evaluations, and hopefully I'll see you in a couple of my other sessions.